Hello, everyone. This is Patrick Morrison from the Wolfpack Astrobiology podcast, and in today's video series, we'll explore the possibility of life on Mars. Mars today is a low-nutrient or oligotrophic and hyper-arid world. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide with small amounts of molecular nitrogen and argon, and trace amounts of gases such as oxygen, carbon monoxide, water vapor, and molecular hydrogen. The average surface pressure of Mars is 600 pascals, with the highest pressure being 1,155 pascals in the Hellas Planitia Basin, and the lowest being 300 pascals at the summit of Olympus Mons. For some perspective, the surface pressure of Earth at sea level is a little over 100,000 pascals. The surface itself is composed mostly of iron oxides, hence the name red planet, and sulfate-based minerals. Essentially, the surface is highly oxidized. Mars is much colder than Earth, with an average temperature of negative 65 degrees Celsius, with a maximum temperature of 21 degrees near the equator, and the lowest temperatures being around negative 140 degrees at the poles. Both the North and South poles are covered in a permanent layer of water ice, and there is another layer of carbon dioxide ice permanently covering the South Pole, while the second layer is only present on the North Pole during the winter. This sounds quite inhospitable, but as we will see, Mars was once a very different place. Along with the other major planets, Mars formed from the protoplanetary disk 4.6 billion years ago. The geologic history of Mars is divided into the pre-Noachian, the Noachian, the Hesperian, and the current Amazonian period. The pre-Noachian of Mars roughly corresponds to the Hadean eon of Earth. If we look at a topographic map of Mars, we can see that the average elevation of the northern hemisphere is much lower than the southern hemisphere. A hypothesis for why this is that 4.48 billion years ago, a giant asteroid hit Mars close to the North Pole, with the northern lowlands being a giant impact crater, but this is disputed. It's estimated that between 4.3 and 4.4 billion years ago, the surface of Mars would have cooled sufficiently for liquid water to exist. First, let's look at Mars during the Noachian period from 4.1 to 3.7 billion years ago. This period covered the late heavy bombardment on Mars. It was during this time that the Tharsis Bulge, on which Olympus Mons and other large volcanoes reside, formed. During this time, it outgassed large quantities of gases to form the early atmosphere. Unlike on Earth, this atmosphere was more reducing, with large quantities of methane and ammonia. Torrential rains were common during the Noachian, with precipitation rates being about 1,000 times greater than during the later Hesperian. Flowing rivers were commonplace, and many lakes formed in impact craters. Furthermore, an ocean named Arabia is hypothesized to have formed in the northern lowlands, but this is still debated. The surface was dominated by phyllosilicate minerals such as montmorillonite, suggesting alkaline conditions were present. The Noachian may have ended with an ice age that saw extensive glaciation across the southern highlands. How could the building blocks of life come about on early Mars? With a more reducing atmosphere, Miller-Urey type reactions could produce biomonomers such as amino acids as lightning passed through the air. Higher up in the atmosphere, interactions between small gaseous organic molecules and UV light would have produced larger organic molecules known as tholins. These would then condense to form a layer of haze in the upper atmosphere, which would then provide UV shielding. On the surface, minerals known as zeolites can act as catalysts, using the energy from photons to produce larger organic molecules from smaller precursors. While most of the UV light would have been blocked by the tholin haze, some would react with transition metal-based minerals and water to produce hydroxide radicals. These could then react with methane to form methanol, formaldehyde, and formate. Alkanes, such as methane, are rather inert, while alcohols, ketones, and carboxyl groups can be fed into pre-metabolic pathways and cycles. Now that we have the building blocks of life, how could they have assembled into early organisms? Unlike on Earth, They may very well have been something resembling a primordial soup on the Noachian Mars. But, as was discussed in the Origin of Life series, this on its own cannot give rise to life because of the second law of thermodynamics. Another problem with the notion of a primordial soup giving rise to life is that a large fraction of the organic molecules produced would have no utility for the first organisms and would instead have an inhibitory effect. This is known as the tar problem. As on Earth, hydrothermal systems would be a likely candidate for the cradle of life on Mars for several reasons. For one, life needs a disequilibrium to function, and hydrothermal systems exist at a mantle atmosphere disequilibrium. The high temperature in minerals in hydrothermal systems is known to catalyze synthesis reactions, which produce biomolecules from simple organic precursors. Finally, wet, dry, hot, cold, and acidic alkaline cycles are staples of terrestrial hydrothermal systems, and these are key drivers of prebiotic chemistry. But instead of being a system where carbon dioxide is reduced to form organic carbon, simple organic molecules would flow in from the surrounding environment. So, while serpentinizing systems are the best candidate for the cradle of life on Earth, due to the lack of a need to produce organic carbon and the more dynamic conditions, a strong argument can be made that life on Mars began in a volcanic system. But how might a Martian organism compare and contrast to life on Earth? Well, right off the bat, on both planets, life would have begun during the late heavy bombardment. This would have delivered tribosite to the surface, which would have then corroded to produce reactive phosphorus species. To see a more detailed explanation of this, see my Origin of Life series. But in a nutshell, it means that life on Earth and Mars could both be powered by phosphorus chemistry, with metabolites being activated by having an organophosphate group attached. Abiotic analogs of the pentose phosphate pathway, the TCA cycle, and glycolysis suggest Martian life could have similar pathways, although they would interact with one another in very different ways. The presence of Montmorillonite clay in the oldest Martian rocks implies that RNA polymerizing reactions can occur and Martian life can use similar genetic material. Lastly, the need to maintain a cross-membrane pH or salinity gradient means Martian life could use this to generate cellular energy, although this would require a high degree of convergence. With the differences in conditions present, there would be some biochemical differences with Martian life as well. For one, the abundance of organic carbon on the surface of ancient Mars suggests Martian life wouldn't have a deep-rooted carbon fixation pathway such as the Wood-Young-Dahl pathway, or at least one that resembled abiotic carbon fixation processes. Finally, the diversity of organic molecules available suggests that Martian organisms would use a greater diversity of amino acids, carbohydrates, and nucleobases than life on Earth. Should life have begun on the Noachian or pre-Noachian Mars, what would the Noachian biosphere have been like? The earliest organisms could have hydrolyzed reactive phosphorus species to power their metabolism and synthesis reactions, releasing orthophosphate into the environment. With a lot of prebiotic chemistry being photochemical, phototrophy could have evolved very early on Mars, in a manner similar to early life on Earth using iron-sulfur clusters to catalyze the production of organic carbon from hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Life on Mars could utilize zeolites as catalysts to produce simple organic molecules from methane, carbon dioxide, and light. Any light with a wavelength above 3,627 nanometers, which accounts for over 90% of all light emitted by the sun, would have had enough energy to carry out this reaction, and the resulting simple organic molecules, such as acetates, can be phosphorylated and fed into biosynthesis pathways. Producing biomolecules from simpler precursors would help mitigate the tar problem. These pathways can then be reversed to give rise to fermentation, where biomolecules are broken down into simple organic ones to produce energy. With an abundant supply of abiotically produced biomolecules on the surface of Mars, fermentation would likely have arisen sooner than it did on Earth. Phototropes would have initially have had to acquire zeolites from the environment, but over time they could evolve the ability to produce their own from more and more simple starting materials. Meanwhile, fermentative heterotrophs could get increasing quantities of energy by breaking biomolecules into simpler and simpler organic ones. This would allow Martian life to spread further and further out from the hydrothermal systems in which they originated. But how far? One proposed hypothesis for the origin of life is panspermia, or the idea that life arrived on the ancient Earth from elsewhere. Some versions of this hypothesis state that life on Earth was originally from Mars or vice versa. Any dispersal event from one to the other would supposedly have occurred during the late heavy bombardment between 3.6 and 4.1 billion years ago, where asteroids would blow chunks of debris from the surface into space, where some of it will land on other planets. Panspermia postulates that organisms were in these chunks of debris and colonized multiple planets from a single origin. Recent research has indicated that the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth today, which lived at the tail end of the late heavy bombardment, could form dormant spores. Although I should add a caveat. Because a microorganism can form a dormant spore doesn't necessarily mean that it can survive in the irradiated vacuum of space. But say an organism was transported from Earth to Mars or vice versa. Could they survive? Well, for one, both Earth and Mars would have Schreibersite raining down from space. So, if primordial life on one of the two planets used reactive phosphorus species derived from Schreibersite corrosion and was transported to the other, they would still have a source of energetic phosphate molecules. Is it possible that life on Earth began on Mars? Well, I would say that the fact that some of the most primitive organisms use a carbon fixation pathway similar to abiotic processes is a strong indicator that life on Earth began with an inert atmosphere present, such as that of the early Earth, versus a reducing one. But if life is transported from one to the other, what problems would they face? Noachian Martian organisms would have evolved in an environment replete with organic carbon, and would probably find it difficult to cope with its scarcity on the early Earth. Conversely, life that came from Earth and fell on Mars would have to face the tar problem, while the metabolism of Martian organisms would be geared to deal with this. The final problem has to do with the availability of enzyme cofactors, which we call vitamins. Many bacteria on the modern Earth can synthesize all the vitamins that they need, but when we look at the most primitive prokaryotes, many can only produce some of the vitamins that they require and obtain others that were released by other cells in the environment. This makes these organisms very difficult to grow in pure cultures in a laboratory setting. So, even if a few cells get transported from one planet to the other, if the surviving cells can't produce all the vitamins that they need, they won't be able to reproduce, and this may make panspermia impossible. While the possibility of panspermia can't ever be ruled out, if Martian organisms are found and have some of the same enzymes as Terran ones, or have the same genetic code, then it's a virtual certainty that panspermia occurred. If Martian and Terran organisms use the same 4 nucleotides and same 20 amino acids, that would count as a gray area.